share my screen. If someone in the chat can let me know once you see it, that would be helpful. All right, Diego in first place. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So we are moving from responsive design to a web accessibility. Okay, so we'll go over this brief overview, and then we're going to start doing a little bit of warm up, get our brains going. I know it's the end of the day, but we're going to get through this. So in this lesson, we're going to learn about web accessibility and its importance in web development. You're going to explore how to design inclusively and in human-centered ways. So by the end of this lesson, we're going to understand what web accessibility is and why it's important, understand the importance and impact of inclusive design, and understand human-centered design. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple trivia questions. Like I brought up previous and yesterday, specifically, let's try to answer these without looking at the answer first, right? I think sometimes that's a little bit more fun. We get some varied answers. So as of 2021, what percentage of websites meet basic web accessibility standards according to a recent WebAIM study? We have 3, 7, 15, and 21%. What are we thinking? Okay, we've got 15%, 21%. All right, we've got a bunch of answers here. Love it. The answer is A. So unfortunately, we're looking at about 97% had some pretty serious failures, which means roughly 3% met basic standards. Now, this isn't to be discouraging, right? This is definitely something that's like we were talking about yesterday. It's new. Um, by and large, it's still in its relative infancy. So that's where even small things are a good step in the right direction, right? Now, with the elements we have here, which ones are going to be crucial for screen readers? We have high contrast color schemes, semantic HTML, fast loading times, or animated transitions. We've got an A in there. We've got semantic HTML. Looks like most people are leaning towards B, and the answer is B. Right. So this is where we talked about where when we have like a header element, a footer element, a section that can really help add some significance to your page without necessarily calling it out. And for people who aren't going to be viewing your website, maybe the way that you designed it. Right. So that's the benefit of screen readers is if we provide the proper syntax and metadata, it can navigate our websites, even though we're not necessarily consciously thinking about how we're designing it for others. So let's think about going to a website that was difficult to use, and we can't mention Codio, right? That's low-hanging fruit. So what barriers did you face? How could web accessibility principles have improved that experience, right? So I typically, when I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking of like paying taxes online, right? I'm dealing with this right now where I have my registration card, right, to renew my I don't know how it is over in Europe, but you have to renew your tags, your license plate every year or every 2 years. And I have everything here I need, but the website's not giving me a good error message to let me know like why I can't proceed. It's not great, right? So I'm gonna have to go in person, unfortunately, and get that resolved. Not excited about that. So I think for me, if you have websites where you try to move forward and it doesn't really tell you why, that's not great, right? So what about y'all? What are some websites you've gone to? Doesn't even have to be recently, right? But you're just sitting here and being like, this is one of the worst experiences I've ever had. Lead instructors, I would not lead instructors, ops team, TAs, feel free to chime in as well. Be curious to hear what y'all have to think. Um, let's see. So Dragosh mentioned Amazon's ticketing website has page numbers navigation only on top. So if I'm looking for a ticket and I get to the end of the page, I cannot get to the next page without going back to the top. Ooh, yeah, that is bad. Omar's dyslexic, so most of them. Yeah, I can imagine. Um, Mohammed said, website of real estate company I used to work for long ago. Yeah, I think a lot of us can probably attest to that, right? Is companies we worked at, our websites may have not been the best. I've done property management, kind of side sister of real estate, and I totally agree with that. Ours was not great either. All right, looks like we've got someone else typing here, and then we'll move on to the next question. And again, the goal here isn't necessarily thinking like we don't want to dunk on websites, right? But we are thinking of very real examples of what is wrong and what could have been improved, right? So to Dragish's point, if the navigation is just at the top, I don't know how they designed this website, but nowadays, you can have components where you could have your navigation up top and the bottom, and it wouldn't be that much extra code, right? So that's, I think, would be how we could overcome that issue. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So, how do we think web accessibility benefits not only individuals with disabilities, but users in general? Okay. So, I'll get us started again. I think we have to remember not like if we're designing not necessarily for only people with disabilities, but inclusive meaning everyone, right? We can think through how, for example, I'm very sensitive to contrast and colors. So if there are colors that don't work well, it's not like a snobby opinion. It's my eyes hurt, right? When I see something that just does not work. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's a disability. It's just I'm more sensitive to these colors. So we think through like, okay, how can we design for everybody in a way that not only is it easy to navigate, but we're not creating hurdles or issues for anyone else. I think again to Dragish's point, right? Like there really should be no reason why you wouldn't have some kind of navigation to move forward and backward on top and bottom of your page, right? That's not even a disability issue. That's more of a why are we making this process more difficult than necessary? So, would love to hear from anyone else, maybe some people that haven't chimed in quite yet. What are we thinking that web accessibility can help with for everyone, not just people who might be considered disabled or more less abled, right? Joseph did mention a particular government website. I couldn't upload a picture, but I didn't know why. Yes, error validation is super, super, super important. We'll learn about that later, right? Sometimes you can say too much with error handling. You don't need to tell them that a network call in our API in the database is not working. Please try again in 30 seconds, right? That's a little too verbose, but you could say, hey, there was an issue uploading your photo. Try again now, try again in 10 minutes, right? There's different things we can do. All right, I do see someone typing in the chat. Here in the example response, subtitles, right? Those can be helpful. As someone who enjoys foreign language films or non-English films, like I have to do subtitles, right? But because of that, I've actually keep subtitles on for most movies now. It actually does help me quite a bit. Dragosh also brought something up too. If you have a specific feature on your website, you should make sure it works as expected, right? Yep, that's very true, and it looks like there's some date validation errors on that end. I have seen that too, where they just assume there's so many days per month and they didn't actually do it correctly. So great, thanks for sharing. So when it comes to web accessibility, what's really important to understand is we want to provide as few barriers as possible to interact with a website. Now, I think speaking from experience, I don't want to be so idealists are so optimistic, or have this utopian view that the entire internet is going to be free and open to everyone, right? That's going to be impossible, especially with not every country is going to have high speed internet, or even internet in general, right? There are still countless people in this world who have no idea what Twitter and Facebook are, and they're that's, I wouldn't say that's even a bad thing, right? But obviously the goal is to make sure that if we are designing websites, especially for clients, that we are not creating hurdles or barriers for people to access anything based on physical, situational, or maybe even socioeconomic, restrictions and disabilities, right? So the goal is, as we are designing and developing these pages, we really want to make sure people have equal access to information and functionality. Now, question, when we are talking about equal access, and we're not really going to get into this, but I want to make sure we think through this. Does equal access mean that everything should be free? And the answer to that is no, right? We're not saying that, everything should be free, that you don't ever have to sign up for anything. Really, again, we're talking about that we are trying to design web pages and applications where even if someone may have slower internet, right, we shouldn't be preventing them from accessing something that would be important to them. Which is why when we get into other development processes, one might argue that, well, not having flashy animations and videos and stuff like that, that could slow down the entryway into someone's, or slow down entry into your application. It could create timeout issues, and then people can't actually access your application. Tatiana asked a great question. I'm glad that someone did. So what kind of socioeconomic restriction can a person experience on a website? So at least here in the United States, a lot of things are moving to be online, in regarding to filing taxes, housing situations, right? Applying for jobs, applying for houses, but not everyone has access to internet. So you kind of create this barrier of, well, I need to do government mandated things. I need to find a home. I need to find a job. But then everyone's telling me I need to go online. Well, maybe I don't live close enough to a library, right? Or if I get on the library, it's not fast enough to access this. Or, there's a multitude of things that can add up. And again, if you are just a basic developer where you're developing a game, that might not be something you're thinking through, right? Because your game is not a pivotal part of someone's life. But when you're thinking about governmental agencies, when you're thinking about different industries, that's where these things are really important to consider. Yeah, so Tatiana's point, not necessarily the website, but again, if you are trying to provide a service and you deem it to be a important service, you should be mindful of the fact that, well, maybe not everyone can access it if you add enough content on there that it would require high-speed internet for it to function correctly. And here later, I'm going to actually show you why that is so important, but we'll get to that here in a minute. We're going to use some developer tools to show you what different websites would look like on different internet speeds. Okay, so this video here, we're going to just take a few minutes to watch, talking about why accessibility matters. I did make sure to share my audio, but if for some reason you cannot hear it, please let me know. I'm going to make sure it's not turned up all the way.
Did you know that 15% of the world's population, according to the World Health Organization, live with some kind of disability? That's over 1 billion people, and they are potentially not able to use your website unless you have made it easily accessible to them. Digital accessibility is about providing equal access and opportunity to people of all abilities and disabilities. That includes visual, hearing, and physical impairments, but also cognitively challenged people, the elderly, and other less obvious groups. Simply put, it's making websites simple and usable for everyone across all devices. This simple idea is recognized by the United Nations as a basic human right. It's not difficult to build accessible websites, and doing so is a great way to take social responsibility and improve your business at the same time. When sites are accessibility optimized, they are easier to navigate and simpler to understand for all users. Accessible websites are also found easier by search engines. All in all, it's positive for everyone. Accessible websites work like a magnet on people with disabilities simply because they can be accessed. Many websites neglect this, and this means they are turning down what could have been loyal customers or users. Also, making your website accessible doesn't strictly mean catering to the disabled. It also means catering to an increasing number of senior citizens. By 2020, the share of people over 65 will reach nearly 30% in Japan, 20% in Europe, and 16% in the US. This is definitely something worth paying attention to because seniors are a segment with strong purchasing power. Accessibility is increasingly also a necessity from a regulatory point of view. In fact, many countries around the world are introducing or tightening existing laws that make accessibility a mandatory focus. Some even enforce this with fines. At Site Improve, we can help you make sure everyone experiences your website the way they were meant to. Let's build a better web for all. Site Improve, a better web for all.
Awesome. And not to be somewhat of, I'm trying to think of the right way to put it, but there is a business side of this too, right? And that's where you can look at this, like they talked about, is, with the senior citizen demographic, they have a lot of purchasing power, which is correct, right? So looking at it from a business perspective and also from an ethical perspective, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. So just remember that, there's multiple reasons why we're thinking about this, because if you have a service and you don't have clients and you don't have donors, you don't have money, right? So there's multiple ways to think about this. So now we're going to think about the POUR framework. Okay, so this is really a good way to help set that foundation for web accessibility. So we want to think about, is our website perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust? Okay, so we're going to go through this a little bit more, but these are the foundation of, I've heard it pronounced different ways, but WCAG, right? Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So perceivable, this means that someone should be able, to perceive the information being presented, right? It can't be invisible or hidden to all of the senses. Now, obviously, we don't have websites where you can smell things yet. Maybe that's coming out with the new Apple headset, that they've got. Maybe someone will figure that out, right? But we do have text alternatives for non-text content. So does someone remember what attribute we have to add to an image so that if the image doesn't load, we get that text description? Alt. There we go. Great job. So things like that. And again, that's not a disability issue, right? That's, something on your website didn't properly load, and maybe it's really important information. Well, the image doesn't load, it still has that text description, so the user isn't completely lost or unaware of what's happening, right? So there's a lot of different ways that we can help our content be perceivable. So some examples being, again, text descriptions to images, closed captions and transcripts, right? Sufficient color contrast. So we don't want to have a red background with pink text on top. That wouldn't be enough contrast. And we also don't want to rely on color alone. So that's where, when we think about HTML markup, for example, what used to be common back in the day would be a bold element tag, right? But now we have strong, right? Or we can add that in the CSS, and the screen reader can help pick up that significance. And also making sure the text is readable, right? I don't know if anyone remembers wingdings back in the day, but we're not going to be using that to display our content, right? Now, we also need operable. And what this means is a user should actually be able to use your website. This needs to make sure that from a keyboard perspective, for example, someone should be able to navigate the entire website. And you might think, well, I don't know if you've tried this before, right? So if I click here on principal and I tab over, right, there's a lot of tabbing that's happening. But ideally, that's the point, right? Someone should be able to tab through a website and navigate through their keys. So I'm going to hit tab again. You see how you have that blue border on the next, so that helps signify where we're at. And now the blue border is around the content table here. And then if I tab again, we're going to go, it was on the X button. Now it's in the search content. And now it's actually over the discussion question too. So at this point, I can move up and down and select each page I want. This is actually something that we're working on, and my main job is we realize not all of our elements are technically what you would call focus, allow a focus state, okay? So that's really important is a user should be able to navigate your website without using a mouse. And it also, we should be able to give users enough time to look at our content, right? So, pop-ups, things like that can be distracting, especially if they're temporary. So we would want something that draws attention, but it's not necessarily time sensitive, right? A game might be a little different, but a basic website, they shouldn't be on a timer, right, to access your content. Also, should go without saying, but avoid content that flashes. If anyone remembers that old school Pokemon episode with Porygon, yeah, there's a reason why that got pulled from the air. Now we have understandable. So we've gone from we can perceive it, we can use it, but we need to be able to understand it. So not just, hey, here's a thing, use the website, right? We actually need to have clear directions. And that's something I feel like a lot of new developers don't think through. So this is a good way to start thinking about this is you know how your application should work, but not everyone else is going to, right? So you can't assume someone's going to know what you intended, right? So that's where it's really important to have clear directions. So anyone, relatively speaking, should be able to walk off the street, get on your website, and use it. We talked about that with Amazon, right? Fairly straightforward. People who've done any e-shopping know how to use Amazon. We also want to have consistency. So we want to make sure if we are providing content or directions in one spot, we're doing the same if the functionality is elsewhere. And then also using plain language. So that one's really big in understanding that not everyone is going to have that same context. So not using larger words when unnecessary, or if you do have to use a textbook definition for something or phrase, you have a way that you define it for the user. Then also being able to identify language. So that part there, that can be a little bit trickier, figuring out how to utilize like Google and stuff to help translate some of your text. But if you are planning on your application or website being utilized by different cultures, then that's really important. Okay. And then last, we have robust. So this is where we get into the metadata, right? So this isn't just thinking through how can someone visibly perceive the website, but am I providing enough content so that a screen reader or accessibility tool can go through the website and not only navigate the user, but interpret what the website is trying to present, okay? And this last one here is really important, is actually testing. So you might have people that are willing to test for you, which is great. Larger companies you typically have focus groups who will help with things like that. So now that we've kind of talked about the foundation here, do we have any thoughts or questions before we move on to the actual standards? Or any thoughts in general as we are thinking through this? Again, I want to call out that all of this is not meant to just focus on someone who might struggle or not fully be able to use your website, right? I think a lot of times accessibility is described in just a disability sense. But again, you're really trying to think through a fully inclusive design and a human-minded design process, right? We are designing websites and applications for human beings. So how can we make sure we respect them and their time and their dignity compared to just designing something and trying to force people to use it in a way that's not natural or helpful to the human experience. Okay. Okay. I don't see any. Oh, let's see. It looks like Omar's typing. And he's gone. Okay. If you have a thought, feel free to drop it in the chat. We'll get to it there. So it's not just important to have from a, I think people would benefit from this, but we're really starting to see that this is now a legal requirement. So the EAA, the European Accessibility Act, requires that everyday products and services to be accessible to people with disabilities, right? So since a lot of these products and applications have necessary services like banking, this needs to make sure that, the websites have that functionality as well. Okay. So the EN 301549, this is going to be the standard that specifies technical requirements needed to conform to that. So keeping that in mind, a lot of accessibility, we're really kind of basing it off of the WCAG, right? The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And this is how we can start working towards a more accessible internet experience. And with the EN 301549, that is the WCAG, what CAG just stands to. The WCAG, that's the guideline for that, right? And we do see that here in the United States and Canada as well. So again, we're trying to think through a more holistic approach with accessibility, not necessarily being region or culture based. So let's take a look at this, right? So the WCAG, it's a set of recommendations to say, hey, we need to make content available in a broader capacity. There is a focus on people with disabilities, whether it's visual, auditory, motor, speech, cognitive, and neurological. So thinking from a who hasn't been able to properly use things in the past, but again, it is meant to be fully inclusive as well. So we really see there's going to be 3 levels in regards to how websites need to conform. So level A, this is like the bare minimum. Everything needs to be met from this, right? So you need to have text alternatives for non-text content and make sure that all functionality is available from the keyboard. So again, that's why my team's working on that, because we weren't intentionally not allowing that, but I think we had some styles or something going on to prevent that from happening. So we're working to fix that. Now, the AA level, this is where we start getting into more common, but more significant barriers as well, right? So, for example, you want to make sure that text and images have a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1, but larger text has a lower requirement. So if we look here, let's do images, get into this ratio, right? I'm trying to remember which website I had used before. We'll get into here. I think, yeah, this one's good here for color contrast. Right. So we see here, for example, that contrast I was telling you before, they're not using pink text, right? But this middle one is at 4.5 to 1. So it's pretty clear that you are going to be able to read this text over this color, right? But down here, that contrast isn't quite there. You're getting closer to the whiter shades in the color. So the white on a lighter color wouldn't be deemed to be the proper ratio, okay? And then AAA, this is where like really top of the line, like how can we make this as good as possible? Again, higher contrast requirement for text and images of text. So that's the 7.7 to 1 ratio. And then also, I really like this one, more restrictive limits on timeouts. And I say I like it because it's really difficult, I think, to figure out the right amount. So, for example, from a security standpoint, you don't want to leave things just open forever, right? Because someone walks away, well, now their banking app's open, right? But you don't want something to time out after 5 minutes. So that's where a lot of applications now, they really just track your activity, right? So if you haven't done anything or interacted with the website in a certain amount of time, that's when they start logging you out, right? But they're not just, the goal is to not log someone out just because they've been on that page for 30 minutes, but they're actually interacting with it. Okay, so this here, you can click through on this as well, but this is the WCAG checklist, right? So we have an Excel spreadsheet here. So I'm not going to go over all of this in detail, but you've got all of the different rules in regarding to whether it's A, AA, AAA, what is expected, right? If you make a copy of this, you could always kind of filter it out, right? Of, you know, having all the single A up top. But this is what you're looking at here is each section is labeled based on the criteria expected. Okay, so I would definitely recommend looking at that. Just didn't want to spend a whole lot of time reading a Excel spreadsheet on this call. Oh, looks like a few people are on here. Awesome. Okay. So let's think about the WCAG requirements here.
Web accessibility is about breaking down barriers that prevent visitors from interacting with the content of a website. There are moral, ethical, and legal reasons to make websites more accessible. No matter the reason, you can accomplish this by following defined guidelines when coding a site. That's it. In many cases, a few characters or words of code in the right place will do the trick. You can see the important conversations happening around accessibility, led by the accessibility community, by searching for the A11Y hashtag on Twitter and other social media. There are 3 levels when measuring accessibility. A, which is the bare minimum. AA is the target level for many businesses. And AAA is typically reserved for special dedicated software. The guidelines are organized around 4 principles. Perceivable. Information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. This includes standards such as providing text alternatives for non-text content. Operable. User interface components and navigation must be operable. For example, all functionality must be available from the keyboard. Understandable. Information and the operation of user interfaces must be understandable. This includes, for example, a requirement to identify the primary language of the page. Robust. Content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. This means being certain to use valid markup, for example. Conforming with level A brings basic compliance to your site. With each level you step up, the more accessible your site becomes. Hitting the basics of web accessibility is relatively easy, although it becomes more complex when you dive deeper into issues and solutions. Even if you can't get full WCAG 2.1 compliance right away, there's still plenty you can do to make a website more accessible. Like help screen readers identify the primary language used in the document, which you can do in HTML. Every page title should adequately and briefly describe the content of the page, meaning each page has a unique title that distinguishes it from other pages. Make sure all images include equivalent alternative text. So the pic of your company headquarters, for example, would be defined as this. Without the alt, the image doesn't exist for a visually impaired visitor, search engines, or people who have turned off images. Everything should be workable from a keyboard, as many people cannot use a mouse, including users and individuals lacking fine motor control. If your site is workable from a keyboard, it will also be workable from an assistive technology that mimics a keyboard, such as speech input. Without a transcript, your audio file is likely inaccessible to people who are deaf or hard of hearing. As an added plus, your transcript will be searchable and add to your SEO. You can even use a transcription service if you don't want to do it yourself. Users should be able to determine the purpose of the link from the link alone and/or its context. Missing open or closure brackets can really mess up a screen reader, so be sure your pages are properly formatted. You can use this markup validation check to find potential errors.
as a person working in the space, it's easy to complicate things. And as well, there you can get lost in the legalese. Whenever you get down to legal things, it can seem more complex than it really is. So I say keep it simple. The simple way to put it is just experience or accessibility. I can define it in literally one sentence, text behind visual elements. Once you know that, you can pretty much do anything. You know the best way to do it, the most compliant way to do it, which is page titles. Make sure you have them. Images, videos, right? So make sure your videos have subtitles. If not, you can even get them transcribed. There are also tools to do that and have that somewhere on your page. And then images, make sure your alt tags are properly filled in, and you can even optimize them for SEO. But all of that relates back to just keeping it simple.
Perhaps you'll notice that a lot of these items are also good for SEO, so you'll get a double bang for your buck on any accessibility work you do. These steps are just the beginning, but they will greatly improve a site's accessibility with minimum work. You can check out the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines to see what else you can do. The tough thing about boosting accessibility is that there are a lot of rules to follow to lift your site up to a high accessibility level, especially if you're working with legacy code. However, even if you're never planning to make it all the way to WCAG AA compliance, you owe it to your users to take as many steps as feasible to make your content accessible. You can assess a site using accessibility assessment tools like Chrome DevTools, AChecker, and PowerMapper. If you're a WordPress dev, you'll be happy to hear that as of March 2016, all new or updated code released into the WordPress core and bundled themes conforms to WCAG 2.0 guidelines at level AA. In the WordPress theme repository, you can search for themes with the Accessibility Ready tag. Plugins are another story, as they're not audited by anyone for accessibility. Ensuring web accessibility is an ongoing process. Make it automatic by becoming familiar with WCAG guidelines and best practices. Build a checklist into your workflow and make sure new content meets accessibility needs. And scan and update existing content. Web accessibility checkers will give you an idea of your starting point. From there, you can organize a plan of attack that will make your site open to all users, or at least as many as possible. Any step you take in the right direction is a good step. Hey devs, have you been enjoying this series? If so, please like, subscribe, and hit that little notification bell so next time you don't miss the newest episode.
Forgot I was on mute. I'm not used to the videos. So, in watching that, I want us to think through what are some things this video could have done to be more accessible? I'm curious if anyone noticed anything here that was different compared to the last video. So Diego says no subtitles. And yes, there's no actual like burned in subtitles, right? So that was the thing with the last video is you didn't have to turn subtitles on to get them. And I think if you're going to talk about accessibility, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? Is add some subtitles. So glad you picked up on that. I would argue the music was actually really distracting. Like I kind of found myself focusing on the music more than the video, which you might think, well, that's not an accessibility thing. Except, yeah, some people can be very really deal with sensory overload, right? So I was kind of thinking through that from a marketing standpoint. Yeah, sure, you want that hook, right? But I think that's something to be mindful of. Is I'll watch some videos online. And if the music's way too loud, like I can't even focus on the video itself, right? But really, I wanted to see if someone noticed that there were no subtitles on the video. I'd be curious to see what the YouTube comments say. Okay, so now that we're going to get into semantic HTML, we're going to go through a few of these examples, by the way, and then we're going to take a break. Okay. So semantic HTML, we've seen a lot of these prior to now, but this is where we have elements that isn't just they state what the purpose is, right? We don't necessarily use them from an appearance standpoint, right? We could theoretically wrap our body content in a header, but should we do that? No, unless that's actually what's supposed to be in the header. So these elements are chosen less for how they appear, right? So let's think back to like our H1s and H6s. We shouldn't be choosing those for how they appear. We choose them for the purpose. So these core elements are going to be the same way, right? So the header element, that's going to signify what is the top section of the page, typically containing any content to introduce the user to the website, navigational links, etc. And then on that note, we would have a nav element where that contains different links to navigate someone throughout the web page, or maybe to an external website, right? Maybe to different social media pages. Now, thinking about that, you could theoretically have multiple headers. I don't know necessarily why, right? But you could. You can definitely have multiple navs, but you really should only have one main, right? Not only from a, well, how can you really have something that's main, but then there's two? So are they equally main? Is one more main than the other, right? Thinking through that, but the screen readers are going to get really confused if you have multiple mains. So keep it at one, right? Because main signifies the highest significance of the web page. Now, the article element, which we've seen, this should be in a website where it should be something that's like could technically be standalone to a certain degree. So I like the examples here. It talks about like a forum post, maybe a newspaper article, blog entry, right? Where you could technically take that article, remove it from that context, and it still holds some sort of significance outside, or it's meant to be shared, right? So if you think about any news article that you share, all that content that's being shared is theoretically should be within that article opening and closing tag. Now, sections, as we see here and we've seen prior, that should be like different actual like sections of a document, right? So if you, let's think through a book, right? You have a chapter, right? Which would be a section, but then maybe within that chapter, you have subsections. So then you'd have another section, right? So really when these contents, you know, if you can group them together, it should be a section. If it can be standalone, it could be a section, right? Now, asides, these actually will be, I'm trying to think of like a good example. So typically if you're reading like a nonfiction book and you have like a little box over to the side that's like, hey, fun fact, and it gives you all this information, right? That's how we would think about as an aside. A call out box, maybe an advertisement, sidebar, something that isn't necessarily integral to the website, but it helps complement. And I don't mean compliment saying, hey, you're pretty, right? But compliment being it helps improve, it betters the other content that it's related to. And then last, we have footer, right? So if we have the header, we have the footer. Typically, you're going to see like copyright data, maybe some other navigation, helpful links, etc. So this document here is going to have a good portion of what we're looking for here. Okay. So looking here, we have our header element, right? So again, if I highlight this, or if I click into that element, you'll see that the closing tag is also highlighted as well. Nice little features here if you're trying to figure out, wait, where's my closing tag at? You get lost, especially if you have multiple ULs, LIs, stuff like that. So we see here that within the body, we have our header element, which also contains the nav element, right? So this is providing just a simple title. And then within the nav, we have our navigation links, right? So in this context, we're imagining there's a blog, and I would be able to navigate to the different posts by clicking these links. Obviously, it doesn't work because it's not a fully functioning website, but just trying to get us to think creatively here. But from a screen reader standpoint, this is where it would say, hey, we understand where we can navigate, right? Whereas the header, the screen reader would know this is the first place we need to start reading the web page, right? Now, inside of the main tag, this is where we had all of our different articles with their specific IDs, right? So by having each article, right? Excuse me. We understand that this is going to be something that is, we want to group them together, but they're individual as well, right? So, for example, in each article, we have the ID to signify what the post is. And then we also have the H2 and the paragraph tag, right? So we understand they're related because they're all within the same main element, but each blog post is separate because they are within their own article element. And then last, we have the footer, right, which just has the copy right here. Okay. What questions, if any, do we have about these different semantic HTML tags? Give people a second to type. Okay, I'm not seeing anything here. So again, I think I've mentioned, oh, now we have some people typing. Awesome. Okay, it seems pretty straightforward. Okay, we got a raised hands up from Omar, and I know he was typing too. Awesome. I will say these are pretty straightforward. The difficulty is just remembering to use them. But if you can set these habits now, unlike yours truly, then it'll be easier. Whereas things like this weren't as prominent when I was learning HTML, right? So that's why we're trying to really instill this in you now so that you don't establish the habits of not including them. Now, I know we've already talked about text alternatives, right? So this is pretty, we're revisiting something we've talked about a lot. But as we already talked about, the alt attribute in an image tag, that's how we're going to describe the image's content or function. Okay, so we need to understand what an alt tag should do. So we're not seeing this image, right? So this is a great example of why an alt tag is great. So, or is helpful rather. So here we see sunny view of Central Park with green lawns and tall trees. Okay, so what you don't see here is an image of sunny view of Central Park, right? Because we already know it's an image. The screen reader is going to know it's an image. What it doesn't know is what the image is of, right? So on the one hand, we want to be descriptive of what the alt text says, but we also don't need to be redundant. And we also don't need to have a 3-sentence paragraph in that image, right? Unless for some reason, maybe it's a text image, right? Everyone has their inspirational posts on Instagram, has those texts. So maybe something like that, you might want to have that, but that would be the exception, not the norm. Now, sometimes you will have images that are purely decorative, right? No information is being distributed at all. Just have an empty alt, right? So having an empty alt attribute is better than not having one at all. Because if you put this here, the screen reader knows, it's not that important, right? Now, again, this is where we're looking at the more complex information. So what we can do is we can add more context around that, right? So on this graph image, the alt text is graph showing climate change over 50 years. And now we see for a detailed description of the graph, see this link. So what we're doing is we're not putting all the information in the alt tag, right? We're going to hope that the image loads. We're going to hope that people are going to be able to access our page, the majority of people, but obviously not everyone's going to be able to. So we can add that extra context for the screen reader to help fill in the blanks. Because again, we don't want to put what all of that actual data is in the alt, right? That would not be helpful to anyone. Now, for text alternatives, for For video text alternatives, this is where we talked earlier about like subtitles, right? And this can get a little trickier. So if you use what's considered an iframe, which I don't know if anyone's seen that before. So an iframe is kind of a way of like embedding a window to something else, right? So what we're doing is we're embedding a video from like YouTube or Vimeo, and chances are those services will auto-generate subtitles, right? Or maybe the video uploader created their own. That's actually a pretty common thing these days. So when you use that iframe for, again, for YouTube, Vimeo, any other video hosting platform, you're trying to embed that video, you're going to kind of rely on their subtitles, whether it has them or not. But what about a company that has its own videos, right? That's not uncommon. So think about, for example, Reddit, right? So if you go to Reddit and there was a video embedded there, the user uploaded the video, well, would there be subtitles there? And I can't speak to how Reddit's going to develop things, but if you have your own website and you're wanting to embed your own locally hosted video, you can actually create your own custom subtitles. Okay. So what we'd do at that point is not use the iframe, but we'd use a video tag. So in that video tag, we'd have a property called controls. Okay, this allows us to press pause, play, etc. We would have a tag that says source, which would say where we're trying to get the video from. And then we also have a track tag. And what we're seeing here in the source is we have a file called captions_en.vtt, okay, video text track. And then we're saying it should be a caption. We're saying it's going to be in English, and the label is English, okay? So I will say this is probably not something you're going to do. And if you do, it's probably a one and done kind of thing. But what's important here to understand is that you are able to create those captions on your own. And without that, you can't add that text that we're striving for with accessibility. So let's look at this example here, okay? So it's pretty straightforward to create a file for a video text track. So if we look here to the right, we see a VTT file. And at the top, we see web VTT in all caps. And underneath, we see a timestamp, 00:00:01.000, which is just saying 1 second, right? So 1 second, or I guess seconds here. And then we have minutes, hours, and then milliseconds here, okay? Then we have our arrow, and it's pointing to 5 seconds. Then underneath that timestamp, we have a hyphen, and then there is a sentence here, there once was a fly on the wall, okay? So again, we're gonna break that down. We have a timestamp for where the text should begin. We have an arrow, a time point in which the text should end, and then a new line with a dash followed by the text we want to display, okay? So just for keeping us awake and active, what we're going to do is let's go ahead and add these timestamps to this file, okay? So we're not going to be able to see it. Unfortunately, Codio does not allow us to embed videos, which is unfortunate. But we can click this little clipboard here, right? And we can paste the new timestamps. So theoretically, if we had a 25-second video, we uploaded this every 5 seconds, there would be a new subtitle from a line from this limerick. So it would be, there once was a fly on the wall. I wonder why it didn't fall, because its feet stuck, or was it just luck? Or does gravity miss things so small? Okay. And then again, down here, we just see that example of what that would look like. So if that is something where you would want to do, have your own video hosted locally and add these subtitles, I highly recommend saving this elsewhere, right? Again, this happens regularly. I just personally have never done it, but I understand also the importance too, right? And we did add a little link here for you as well if you want to look through how to do this. And this is just some extra resources for you based on whether you are using a Mac or Windows computer. Okay. Now, getting back into headings and the structure of a page, again, it's really important that we're using the heading tags to define the hierarchical structure of the content, right? So the H1 is the highest level of importance, and it should be used for the main page title. So it should only be one on each page. Otherwise, our headings go from H2 to H6, and it should decrease in the level of importance, right? And the reason for this is it can help the screen reader know how the page is actually organized, right? Maybe, and to think through it as well, it's not uncommon for an H1 to be at the top. Maybe you have an H2, then an H3, and then an H2, and then an H3, right? So it's not always just gonna be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's so much variation that can happen. So by using those heading elements properly, you're helping the screen reader understand the level of importance of your page. So again, always start with an H1 for the page title. This is the first thing screen readers are going to announce, so it should be descriptive of the content of the page. But also keep them concise and descriptive. So it should be a summation, a summary of what the content is. Let's say they don't want to read the entire section, right? So they can quickly know, oh, this is about marketing. This is about business to business sales. They're only concerned with business to business sales, so they skip over the marketing. Now, we don't want to skip levels, right? We don't want to go from H1 to H3 and no H2. So the screen reader might think there's missing information, okay? So Mohammed, you asked a great question. In terms of articles, is it okay to use multiple H1s? So again, that speaks to there should only be one H1 per page, right? And what I mean by page, I'm not talking about website. I'm talking about each individual page. So if you were on a website and the H1 was the blog title, that should be the only H1, right? You don't want your H1 to be the blog post title. You would want it to be the name of the entire website would be the H1. So then if you had a blog post title, without knowing the rest of your website, I would argue that's probably an H2. So you could have multiple H2s. You have 500 blog posts. They all use an H2 for the title of that article. But the name of the blog, the name of the website should always still be that H1. Does that make sense? And if it doesn't, I'm happy to clarify. Cool. Got that thumbs up. So let's look at here. Look at this page, right? And this is driving me crazy, so I'm going to beautify this. There we go. Awesome. So as we see here, the H1 is the delicious apple pie recipe. All these food examples when I'm not eating lunch. So this describes the entire purpose of the page, right? Is delicious apple pie recipe. However, what if this website was actually called David's Fabulous Recipes? Well, now we would probably want to change the delicious apple pie recipe to be the H2, right? Because our heading element would be the H1 or the title of the blog. But for this example, this is the most important text is the title, right? So that's why we keep it as an H1. Now moving forward, what we're doing is each section has an H2, right? So these are going to be the major sections of the recipe. So we have introduction, ingredients, instructions, comments, okay? Now, from here, we have our H3s, and these are our little subheadings, right? So step 1, step 2, here we have different users. I didn't see that Gordon Ramsay. I didn't scroll down. That's funny. So the H3 then, this is where, again, we have these subheadings. They help us understand that these are important, but they belong to another section, right? But then we see here in the footer, the H2 is used again, right? Because again, these are all on the same level, right? So the title is on one level. Each section is on a different level. And then inside of there, you have your subheaders that are on a different level. And then your paragraph tags are on their final level. Okay. So thinking through, each section has their own relation, and that's the importance of using the heading elements based on the role, not the pixel size of the text. All right, so we've got 2 sections here, and then we're going to take our we're going to take a 10-minute break. Okay. So getting into ARIA roles, this is something that's a little bit newer. So we have accessible, rich internet applications. Now, ARIA, what this does is it gives you attributes that you can actually add some metadata for accessibility to elements. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a semantic HTML element. Okay. So Mohammed, I will come to your question. Veronica, if you could jump in and answer that as well, but I'll address this publicly too. So again, the benefit here is you could have a regular div, right? But as you see here in section 1 for the ARIA roles, we can actually assign elements a role, right? So maybe you don't want to use a nav tag, right? Maybe there's a reason why you need to use a div for some reason. So now we can assign it a role of navigation. So in doing this, this allows the assistive technology to interpret that role based on, or the element based on the role, right? So now we can you could technically create a button with a div, and now you assign it the role of a button, right? So these roles really give you some flexibility in designating what different elements are. And if we go here and we search for ARIA roles, there's a handful of them. So now it does say here, for most document structure roles, semantic HTML equivalent are available and supported, right? So there are some that you don't necessarily want to use. Let's find that navigation one here. So landmark would be how to organize or structure a web page. So maybe you have a banner role, a form role, a region, right? So again, there's some flexibility here in how we can designate what each element should do. Now, inside of here, or I guess next rather, we have the ARIA properties and states. Okay. So this is how these elements should be treated by the assistive technology. So what it means is if you had like a drop-down menu, you could have, is it expanded? And you'd pass in false for false. So if you were to open it, it should update to true, right? So we see here in this example, when the button's clicked, you would update that ARIA expanded to true and remove the hidden attribute from the submenu to show that it's now available. Again, this context doesn't do a whole lot since we're not actually working on it hands-on. But I have personally used the ARIA roles when I am trying to target stuff with JavaScript, which we get into targeting later, but there is a very helpful purpose for those. And again, it really does help the screen reader. You can make these elements a little bit more granular. So here we have what's called the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide, and we can click through on here if you would like. But the point is, this is going to, so we can actually see what these best practices are, okay? So you're going to see a phrase in your development journey called design patterns. So we want to make sure we are designing our elements and using the ARIA roles based on how they've established we could use them, okay? As we've seen with coding, you can do things different ways. It still works. Is it best practice? Maybe not. That's where these design patterns come in. Also, implementation guidance, because maybe you just don't know what to do, right? So this documentation will help you understand how to implement these different features. And it also gives us some examples too, right? So if we click here on the button, it's going to talk about why we may want this role as a button. And it does go through and just explain why these roles and patterns do exist. So again, going through things like this on a call, or on a lecture like this, you really are going to get more by getting a little bit more hands-on. So I would definitely recommend at least bookmarking this, right? So what's really interesting though, and I like this argument, is no aria is better than bad aria. So before using that, they're suggesting you to read this. This first principle here is really important to understand. So a role is a promise. So if you add a role of a button, you are saying this div is going to be a button, and it's going to be, it needs to work as expected, right? So it says here, using a role without fulfilling the promise of that role is similar to making a place order button that abandons an order and empties the shopping cart, okay? So just understand as you learn about these ARIA labels and ARIA roles, if you're not using it correctly, better just not to use that at all, okay? So like I said, we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna assume it's 10 after. So let's come back at 20 after. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah. Let's see how everyone is doing. I'm gonna launch a poll here. You can see it, right? Yeah, we're getting the answers. Eleven answers.
That's looking pretty good there. So,
Yeah.
so anyone who's feeling like you don't fully understand it, this is always a good opportunity to schedule some office hours with Veronica, or as always, I mean, there's a lot of great resources out there. But what I would suggest is just revisiting the Codio lecture too, right? So that's something where, people forget, y'all can go back to the lesson, right? And look at the notes and watch the recording again, and practice makes perfect. So, all right. So let's go ahead and talk about color contrast. Okay. So we've already talked about where that itself can be I would say it's a difficult thing to understand, but it can be hard sometimes to figure out what to do, right? Especially if you don't feel like you're design minded, or it's truly, it can be hard to, well, does this color even work, right? Does this design even work? So really here, the goal is not to have you be a professional level designer. It's understanding that if there's text or really anything in the foreground, right, in the background, we need to make sure that it is visible and is not going to be difficult for people to view or interpret what we have, okay? And, it's not even just visual impairment in a sense of, being able to barely see things. It's also colorblind, right? Is we have to understand that not everyone's going to see colors the same way. So with the WCAG, they have some scientific data that they've calculated and put together to present these guidelines. So for normal text, like your body text, they really want that minimum contrast of 4.5 to 1, right? So this means that the brightness of the text needs to be at least 4.5 times higher or lower than the background color. So if we have black text on a white background color, right? So black text on white background, rather, that's going to have a high contrast ratio, and it is easy to read, right? We see that with books. I mean, when was the last time you read a book that had red pages and green text? That doesn't happen. Now, with larger text, it can be a bit lower, right? So the brightness of the text needs to be about 3 times higher or lower than the background, because larger text is easier to read. Now, this here, we have the ability to do a contrast checker. Okay, so what we can do is we can select the foreground and the background of something and being able to see how it works and what the contrast is. So it shows us the difference between normal text, large text, and then like a graphical object and user interface components. Okay, so I'm going to keep going back to my example of red and pink. So we've got the red here, right? So actually, even just red text, it's not going to fail. It's not going to pass the most of these, right? It's only 3.99. So then let's do, actually, I'm going to choose pink here for this one, which is definitely going to fail. And then I'm going to do a background of red, which is, yes, also failed, right? It may be good for Valentine's Day, not so much for your everyday web usage. So let's try something out. I would love to see in the chat, let's find an example of a not ideal contrast ratio, and let's see if we can find a contrast ratio that would be well and above that 4.5 to 1. I'm curious to see what you all come up with. I'm going to try something here. So if we do green, I like a forest green, right? Just to kind of go into here. Oh, yeah, 1.8. It's not even 1.8, it's 1.08. So obviously a white is going to be okay, right? We're almost there. So black would work, right? That gives us to 5.68, but we're still not quite there for the AAA for the normal text. So I'm wondering, so I can adjust the slider here, right, to figure out how to get it to pass. So if I can get it, yep. So if I do this lighter green and the black, I can get it to 7.14 to 1 ratio, and it passes everything that I need. Let's see if anyone has any examples that they came up with. Okay, so Mohammed, you've got that. Is that for the foreground or the background? Let's see. Let's throw that in there. Looks like if we did that for the foreground, we could come really close if we went that route. But let's try that as the background. Yeah, so it ends up being about the same. It's actually the exact same based on foreground or background. So I'm curious to see what would be the other color you chose, Mohammed. Looks like Acer had white and gray. Yep, that's typically a good option as well. And then let's see here. Timo came up with, he got 5.85. That's awesome. And that still hurts my eyes, but it does work, right? That purple and that blue is just ooh, that gets me for sure. But again, that's where it's less about how it looks from a design standpoint and just is the contrast as expected. Oh, Charlotte Hornets, you're totally right. I didn't even think about that. That's funny. They do not pass the contrast check. Maybe they need a rebranding. Okay, awesome. So now we're going to talk about relative font sizes. So we've kind of seen glimpses of this, like ems, rems, percentage, right? So a pixel would be a fixed size, whereas percentage, when we talked about layouts yesterday, do we remember how we described that? We had a fixed layout, and then it also started with an F. I'm drawing a blank on what it was called. Another kind of layout. See if anyone remembers. Give it a few more seconds. So it's going to be fluid. Okay. So in the same way, these are going to be a bit more fluid because it's going to be able to adapt and fit the size, the screen size, right? It's going to react based on that. So the way to think about this is, and not to think about, but the definitions themselves. So an EM, this is going to scale relative to the font size of its direct or nearest parent. Okay, so we'll see what that looks like here in a minute. Whereas a rim, which I typically use more than M's, a rim is going to scale relative to the root element's font size. So if the font size for a page is 16 pixels, one rim would be 16 pixels. Then you would increment that based on if you did like 1.25, that would be 1.25 of 16. So that would be 20 pixels. And then percentage is just based on the parent element's font size. So if you remember that, even with the width, right? So if we have a div inside of a div, if the child div is 50%, it's 50% of the parent div. Okay. Let's take a look here. So with our CSS, the font base size for the entire page is set to 100% of the default browser font size, which is usually 16 pixels. So let's go ahead. I know it's a little small here, bear with me. I'm gonna use my developer tools, look here, right? And we have, because of the window size, let me try to fix that. Okay, there we go. Nope, it's still too small. This may not be good to try to do in Codio. So I'll just go over it visually, and then you can always get into the developer tools. Trying to do the developer tools in the Codio previews always hit or miss. So I'm gonna close out of there. So again, the base font size for the entire page is set to 100%. Okay. Now the headings, right? So we have the H1 and H2 here. We are setting based on rem. Okay, so that's relative to the root font size. So that is going to scale based on the base font size change. Okay, so I could go in here and we have font size is 1 rem, right, for the body. Okay, now let's change the font size here. Let's not do 100%. Let's do 8 pixels. Okay. So now we see everything that was rem based has changed as well. I didn't change any of these font sizes, but it's going to be either 1 rem or 2 rems or 1.5 rems or 0.875 rems, right? Based on the root font size. So then I could change this to 32, and now everything's really big, right? So we see here our paragraph tag is 0.875 rem, so it's not quite 30 pixels, but then everything else is based on that relative size. Okay. So we see here the paragraph tags, they are supposed to be set in M's. Looks like someone left that as a rem. So that means it's going to be a little slightly smaller than the root size, right? So it's going to be scaled on the parent element. And then we also do have the media queries to adjust the font size based on the window screen here, right? So now the max width is 768, the font size should be 90%. And then if it's 480 pixels or less, it's going to be about 80%. Okay. Again, this is pretty crazy to have font this big, but the point is when you change your root size, that's going to affect all of your rems here. Now, I had mentioned earlier about elements having a focused state, okay? So a focus indicator this is what's going to help users who rely on a keyboard to navigate websites. So this gives a visual cue that's going to say, hey, is this element selected or not? And it's not just a button, but typically it's like form elements, links, etc. So it's really important that these elements are visibly focused on, okay? Otherwise, a user has no idea where they're at on the screen. So even though you might look at that and be like, wow, that's really clumsy, it's not about you, right? Or clunky or whatever. It may not look, you know, as sleek as some of these websites are. But again, it's not about just the average person. It's about someone who may not be able to use your application or a website in the same way that you might be able to, right? So we're designing to be able to help all sorts of users be able to access your application or your website. Now, when it comes to the actual styling, right, we don't want to have a white border on something like that. That'd be pretty silly. So having that blue is actually pretty common, I found. Is now it might be a little bit less padding, right? But the blue typically indicates a focused state. So with this code here, what we did is we added a 3-pixel solid blue outline to the element. So with this example, if I tab over each element, you're going to see that each thing is getting its own focused state. Okay, so in our CSS, what we're saying here is when things are focused, not only are we adding a outline, but we're adding a background color and a border color. Okay, so if you really want to make sure that this is working the way we think it is, I'll go in here. I'm going to change this to like a fuchsia-ish color. I'm going to change the background color to yellow. This is not for accessibility, right? Wouldn't be able to read any of this. But you see those changes we made are very evident. So we're not just changing the border color, it's the outline as well, right? So if I was to remove the border color here, there is still going to be an outline that indicates that we have hovered over it, right? So again, things like this, you may not have thought about this prior, but these are small things that we should be doing as we develop and style our websites to make sure that as a person is going through that they are fully aware of where they're at in the website as they're using their different accessibility tools or just even using the keyboard. Before we move to the next section, any questions about what we've covered so far about applying CSS styles to these elements? I'm still just laughing at that Charlotte Hornets example, though. Great job, Timo. Okay, Omar says he's good. If I see anything pop up, I will make sure to address that. All right, so animations and motion. So yes, animations can be helpful, right? Especially when you think about like hovering over a button, you know, that might help add a little bit of focus there that you wouldn't have otherwise. But people who do have disorders such as vestibular disorders leading to like motion sickness, for example, you really do want to try to accommodate for that, right? So this is a newer media query property that you can add in. But what you can do is with the prefers reduced motion media query, you can actually style your CSS a certain way, right? So if you know that you have animations on your pages, you can set this up to prevent those animations from being utilized. Okay. So this here, we see, you know, I am hovering over and it is working. Now, at the end of the day, again, I don't have these system settings on here, nor is it something that most people are going to have that, right? But this is what that code would look like. So it would look for prefers reduced motion, and then it'd say reduce, and then say animated element transition is none. Now, I could go in here, right? And let's look at CSS media queries, prefers reduced motion. So the different values that we can pass in, I think the easiest way would be, I wonder if that, I didn't try this one beforehand. No, that wouldn't work there either. So really, it'd just be a matter of figuring out how to get into your system configuration to do that. Again, it's just a situation where on these examples, we're not seeing a full wholesale adoption quite yet, right? Because these are still fairly new. Now they are fully supported, right, by the newest browsers. It's just not something you're going to see very commonly. But the more and more we're starting to develop and be mindful of accessibility, it is something that we can do. So right here, let's go ahead. Let's actually test this out, right? I know you're not going to be able to see my settings, but I'm going to go to system preferences. I'm going to go to accessibility, and then let's go to display and reduce motion. I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to hit refresh, and I don't know if it will update right away. Oh, yep. So I don't know if you see that, but there's no actual like ease animation anymore. So that transition is no longer happening. And honestly, that's more jarring, right, to see that. But I'm going to go ahead and turn that back off. And now we actually already see the animation right away, right? Did anyone not see that? I just want to be clear the difference there. And actually, I didn't even have to refresh the page. It actually just went ahead and did it immediately. So that's good to know. So I'm going to throw that here in the chat. The Mozilla documentation, I can't stress that enough, like how often I'll go there if I want to figure something out. Okay. So I know it says break here, but we've already had that. So we're going to move on to the lab. So this lab, refactoring is something that's really important to understand. So before today, who here has heard the phrase refactoring, or at least who here knows what refactoring means? And if you don't, there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm curious to hear or see how many of you are familiar with the concept of refactoring. I was more familiar with it from a mathematical standpoint before I started developing. It's like Joseph is typing. That's a good gift. Restructuring existing code. Yep. So refactoring is actually pretty common in a developer's life where, you know, especially when you join a company, they're probably not going to have you they're not going to ask you to write brand new code right off the bat, especially not like a brand new application, unless maybe you're a senior, right? So instead, they typically will have you work on existing code. Maybe you need to change the complexity. Maybe you need to move things around from one page to another, right? So thinking about refactoring, what we're doing is we're taking the existing code without actually changing the external behavior, right? So by the time you're done, everything should work the same way, but you've changed the syntax, organization, the complexity, etc. Allows us to have code that's readable, maintainable, and performs better. So in this context, what we're thinking about is we're going to be refactoring some code to be more accessible. So ideally, your code shouldn't really look too much different than what we had, but there should be accessibility attributes and features added in. So what we're going to do is we're going to take at least 3 things we learned about today to improve the code that we're going to see here. Okay. So I'm going to go over these descriptions, and then we're going to take the rest of the class to go to work on this. And since it's about 44 after now, we'll get back together around 10 after to work on this together. So what we're going to do is we have this existing not Twitter page, and we're going to add some accessibility features to this page. Okay. So out of these, we need to choose at least 3. So the first one is semantic HTML. So let's make sure that the HTML structure of the project is used, like we're using these actual semantic HTML elements, like a header, nav, main, section, etc. So it should be the entire page is refactored, right? What we're not looking for is just making a new header and then we're done, right? Like, and there is a header here, but like you really should be redoing the entire thing to have those sections in there, okay? Or those elements in there rather. Text alternatives, right? So at this point, we don't have any alt text on any of the images or elements that would need them. Going through and refactoring and adding the proper H1s through H6s, okay? For the ARIA, we can add some roles, labels, described by, right? We didn't go over all of those, but as always, you're encouraged to, utilize your resources as expected. Working on color contrast, right? Make sure that the page has the proper contrast. Refactoring the page to use relative font sizes, rem, percentages, etc. Then also going through and making sure you have the proper focus indicators, right? There are some on there that are kind of built in, so to speak, but we want to make sure that we're going to have everything that we actually need. Okay. So let's go ahead and make sure, like I said, it's 46 after now. Let's give it to about 10 after. So Juan, if you wouldn't mind, we can get some music going. So obviously there are a lot of different approaches we can take with this, right? Because there were 7 different options and it really depends on which one you decided to do. So before we go over a few, were there any of these where you're like, I don't know which approach to take? Or rather, you didn't know how to solve that approach. That's what I meant to say there. And if there's not, that's fine. I just want to make sure that we at least cover any of them that we may have confusion about. Relative font sizes, okay. Look at that one. If there's any others, we'll just focus on that. ARIA, okay. And focus indicator, yep. Okay, so let's start with just the relative font size. That was the first one that was brought up. So again, something to keep in mind is typically in a browser or a website, you're going to have a root font size, okay? And you can do whatever you like. You can set that to be what you want, but 9 times out of 10, it's going to be 16 pixels, okay? So if we change here font size to 16 pixels, since we don't have any relative sizes, nothing should change, right? At least I didn't see anything that would have changed. Let's try again. Oh, okay. So what we could do is using a little math. If we were happy with what we had here, we can just refactor all of this, right? And for at least the relative font size, and we're not going to worry about like padding and stuff like that. So here, user info, we want to target the H2. Well, we have 16 pixels here, right? So let's change that to 1 rem. So ideally, we shouldn't see any changes. Awesome, right? Because a relative unit, the rem, is based on the root text size. So since it was already 16 pixels, we can just change that to 1 rem and we're good. If we change this to 1.5 rems, do we see how the handle is bigger now, right? So let's leave that at 1 rem so we know it works. Okay, and then we could go down here, find some other font size. So again, the comment form The text area here is going to be 16 pixels, so we can change that to 1 rem. The button is also 16 pixels. We can change that to 1 rem as well. Okay. Now, what I'm noticing though is what about this here, right? Just the paragraph tag. I mean, do we have a font style for that font size? I mean, it is the root size is that 16, right? So what if we did, let's target paragraph, the font size 0.875 rem. Just make it a little smaller, right? I think that's good to have some kind of difference here. So, but again, that's how we would refactor the font size. If the font size was 16 pixels as the root, and we wanted to keep everything at that size, we would just do 1 rem. We see here, I changed the font size for the paragraphs to be 0.875 rems. So if I use my handy dandy calculator, take 16, multiply that by 0.875, so it would be 14 pixels. Okay? So that would be one thing we could do. The aria, right? So we could go through and so here's kind of the kicker, right, with the aria. So let's look at, in Google, we search aria label. So the aria label attribute defines a string value that labels an interactive element, okay? So here we have a button, right, in this example, and the aria label is close, okay? And while we don't really see that example right here, what we could do is in the button, we could do aria label, oops, we could put like, right? And you might think, well, isn't that pretty self-descriptive? And it would be. So we wouldn't necessarily have to do that here. What would be helpful for that, if you think about like the round close buttons where we'd have an aria label, that would be helpful for that. We don't really have anything here, so the aria label may not be the best approach, right? So then we could look at some different aria labeled by, right? So probably not what we want as well. So I mean, really, it's one of those things where if you look here and none of these apply, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because we did choose a button here, right? So that button has that built-in role. But if you decided you want to refactor an image or a button to be a div and you style it that way, you could add that role. If you really do feel like adding that role here too, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? We are just specifying what that role is. But really, I would suggest going through, so just aria attributes. And actually, this one was really good. I remember looking at this a while back. So I'm going to share this in the resources here. But this will go over like what aria can actually do, like your different role names, being able to, understand why those exist. And again, when it comes to aria, the goal here is not necessarily to have this memorized right now, but just as you practice, when you create custom elements, it can be really helpful. So again, I would suggest kind of just going through that, looking at it a little bit. The roles here probably aren't going to be as relevant, but you could also add a role to an image, right? So I would suggest kind of looking into that a little bit and figure out how to do that. Now, in the live chat, there's a couple other ones. It looks like focus indicator. So right here, we have some styling on the focus, and this is where, or on hover rather. So if you look at our previous examples, we see a pseudo class. And here for hover, it's :hover. And I think maybe you remember that in the first week. I think it was a little jarring for people to be like, wait, what are we doing now? So let's go back to our focus indicator. Okay. So in our CSS, we have a colon focus. So the colon focus is what we call a pseudo class. So what this is saying is when you have a element, a tag being the hyperlink, and it's in a state of focus, this would apply. So for our example, I'm not going to be fully telling you what to do, right? I kind of want you to try it out. But this is where if you want to make sure certain elements have that focused styling, you would figure out which tag you want to target, and you would do the at focus, right? And then from there, you can decide what you want to apply. So maybe you want an outline, maybe you want a border, a background color, right? So whatever your selector is, just like this hover, you want to have focus instead. Okay, so then when Veronica grades it, she should be able to tab through. And again, you're going to see that some of these are already present, right? But it's not for everything. So figure out how you want to target that focus state. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about that? Because again, as we're progressing here, we want to make sure we're not providing all of the answers, right? But we want to at least provide the solution to move forward so that you can solve these. And this one here is less about designing something entirely. It's more of just refactoring to have this functionality. Okay. And then Joseph, looks like you had a question about number 1, how to refactor. So really think about how you could change these divs to be sections, maybe, or maybe they need to be an article, right? Or if, obviously these aren't going to be footers. So it's really understanding the role of the main, which you already have, and then different sections and articles. So if you remember, a section would be a group of content, right? Whereas the article is something that could be distributed independently. So, I mean, a social media post could be distributed individually, right? So that would be a good candidate for an article. But then maybe you'd want to have a section that contains all of the different tweets. Does that make sense, Joseph, there, or anyone else? Does that clarify what we're looking for with that one? Awesome. Okay. So yeah, I would say, those at least cover a few that you could do. The ARIA one, don't get too hung up, right? You don't have to do all of them. If that one really doesn't make sense, again, this is newer technology, or I say newer, within the past 5 or so years. So try something else, right? When it comes to development, the last thing you want to do is you hit this hurdle and you get stuck and you get paralyzed and you just don't do anything else, right? We're giving you the option to try other things here. You don't have to do all of them. So if it really doesn't make sense right now, that's fine. Try another one and you can always come back and learn about it, right? The life of a software developer should be one of continual learning. So if something doesn't make sense now, welcome to the club. I guarantee other people don't get it either, but you can continually learn and progress. So don't worry too much, right? Just take the time, figure out which ones are going to work for now. Don't hold yourself up and then you're behind just because you think you're stuck on something. Okay. And again, Veronica is always open for help. So please make sure you're utilizing that. She cannot help you if you don't say that you need help. Okay. So any other questions, please make sure you can direct to us as well. I know I'm not a TA, but I still try to keep an eye on the chat, help as much as possible. But I think we're good. So we can end the recording. And then I think we have